Excellent. So hello everyone. My name is Steve Campbell. Just a bit about me. So I own and run a firm called Sunny BI. So we do data monetization consulting, right? We do Power BI mainly. I'm a Power BI and Excel trainer, so I do lots of training, something I really enjoy doing. Bit about me. I lived in the UK, where I currently live. I've lived in Australia and the USA as well. Lived in the States for about 9 years. Here is my LinkedIn profile. I do loads on LinkedIn, so definitely come and follow me there if you find this interesting and want to see more. So, what a very long title for something quite simple. 10 tips you should know to level up your data storytelling and visualizations. This is going to be quite a random 10 tips, I would say. These are kind of 10 things that I go through and I see a lot. So when I've been consulting, when I've been designing and training, kind of 10 tips that really help. Not any specific ones, and there'll be some which are general about visualization and some which are very more specific about Power BI as well. Some of them you've probably heard before, and I'm sure you know some of them in a bit of detail, but it's good to kind of go through. These are 10 things I typically go, and just 10 mistakes as well that sometimes I see people do by not kind of applying these tips. So, and I want to say just before we get in, at the end as well, we'll go through a bit of a design process, which kind of brings this all together, the 10 tips, and then just shows how we can kind of build Power BI reports specifically. So the first one is cause versus correlation. Hopefully you've heard of this before. A lot of people have, but I still see this being ignored and not being applied in reporting, especially tools like Power BI when we do trend analysis, this sort of stuff. So if I was to show you this graph, this is two different data points, right? So we have the black line and the red line. Now, if I looked at this, I could see that from the years 2000 to 2009, I would say these are pretty related. If I put these two on a graph like this and displayed the data in this way, to me, I think that would very well show the point being, these two as the black kind of goes down, the red also goes down. We can see even 2005, they both sort of bounce back. However, what I've done is I've just removed the legend. So if I put the legend back on, the red line is the divorce rate in Maine, and the black line is the per capita consumption of margarine. And I think this is for United States. So this is not really related, and you see this website down the bottom. This is where I got this graph from. There's loads of these, and they're quite funny if you're a nerdy data person and like this sort of stuff. But the point being here, these two really have nothing to do with each other. They're very correlated, but one isn't causing the other. I would very much assume they might be. So a divorce, we might be getting divorced because we're eating lots of margarine. I think, though, it's quite unlikely. And the point being is we see this a lot. And when we are building Power BI reports, we often focus on the technology and how to bring the most insights, really think about what we can do from a technical aspect. We have to be really careful what we're implying. If I put these two on a graph like this is we're not outright saying, but we're very much implying that these two are probably to do with each other when I'm displaying it together. Just because they're correlated, right, does not mean one causes the other. And here's a big one. If I was to go where I am now in Dubai and count how many people are wearing sunglasses, and then also count how many people are sunburned, those would both be quite high. When I get back home to London, it's a bit rainy there. Probably not many people are wearing sunglasses and probably not many people are sunburned. But these are very highly correlated, but an incorrect assumption would then say, okay, you're more likely to get burned if you wear sunglasses because the more people are wearing sunglasses, the more people are sunburned. Of course, that's not true. We know there's a third factor, the sun, which is causing both of these. So it's really, really important to understand your data. And when you're showing, especially trends and trends on more than one thing, we're often looking what's causing sales to go up, what's causing churn to go down, this kind of stuff. We have to be careful. Not to say you can't show things that are correlated, but it's very important to understand your data, dig a bit deeper, and not kind of imply and make assumptions unless you're sure of underlying causes. And it really goes beyond just technically putting them on a page, but again, understanding your data and making intelligent design moves. So tip number 2, KPIs. As I say, these aren't necessarily related. They're going to be 10 completely different ones, but ones I see very often. KPIs. Now, hopefully, if we've used Power BI, we do know this one, or at least know part of it, but there are rules for KPIs. And this is something that Power BI, thankfully, does automatically or tries to do. But the first one, when we're displaying numbers, this is, of course, way too detailed. I don't need to know that my sales, the pence on this sales amount. I don't need just 1.2560 to 5.15. What I really want to do is just show enough data that's needed by the end users. And this will require knowing how your end users are looking at this and what they want to do with this KPIs. And that's really the important point here. When you're doing this KPI, you should know how the end users are doing it. Most of the time, it's 1.3 million would be enough detail, right? Because they're probably just seeing the high level numbers and then we'll go and investigate something else. When we have it like this is a much easier to read format. So knowing what your end users want. The next thing is try and show some context. Again, why is your end user looking at this number? Normally, when you have a KPI, they really want to compare it against something. Because if you just said, my sales are 1.3, that's good. It's compared to what, right? You need some context for that number. Often people want to compare against last year, against a target. Maybe they're tracking specific targets. So you need to understand how they're using it so that we can add the appropriate target. Already, I can see that this is 1.3 million and we're down 12% last year. This is just made up numbers, right? And I already know that there's some context we're probably not doing as well as we should. And I kind of know the volume and the scale. So really understanding how your end users are going to be using this. Now, tip number 3, simplify. Simplify is one that's very, very important. And for this, I'm actually going to pop over here and we'll have a look at some comparisons. So when we have a graph like this, and this is quite common, it's very hard sometimes for us to compare total sales versus last year's sales. What my issue with a graph like this is that it makes users have to do extra work. So depending on, again, how the user's looking at it, there's a few things that I could do, and there's a few things that would change the way I design this. When you have a kind of a bar graph like this, we have total sales and last year's sales. It's very hard, though, to kind of compare this year versus next year because it's not next to each other. The light blue, so total sales, we have to kind of ignore this blue, and it just makes it a bit harder for us to read if we're comparing. Not necessarily, the variances aren't that easy to see because we've got two categories next to each other. It clutters the graph out a bit. A couple of tips I like to do. I'm just going to copy this graph and put it here. So you'll see this is just a column. We've got category in the x-axis and then total sales and last year's sales. One of my favorite tips to do is when I'm doing this sort of graph where I'm showing total sales, and this is by a category, right? Not over time. So this is by a certain category. So we can't use line graphs. What we want to do is I like doing a trick called the old line and column chart. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this and to this one into the line and the column chart. Now I'm going to change and I'm going to put my last year sales into my line axis. And let me, I've still got some formatting, so let me bring this up again so it's not coupling to the end. So just testing. So I'm just going to build this from scratch. I'm going to say, put the product there. I'm going to put my total sales and my last year sales. Bit of lag here as that kind of builds up. So now I have my total sales and my last year sales. Now my last year's sales is on a line graph. So again, we don't want to do a line graph because this is comparing categories and we don't want to have a line graph for a category. It already makes it a bit cleaner because I just have one bar in each category. And for the bar graph itself for this year's total sales, it's quite easy to compare. So one thing I like to do is I'm going to go over and I'm going to turn the markers on. This is the markers on for the line graph. If I open the markers, I'm going to change their shape. I'm just going to do this dash here. I'm going to make it pretty big so we can see. So now this has put a line and I know where the line graph is. Now here's where the magic happens. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to reduce the stroke width down to 0. So I'm essentially building my own bullet chart. This is a really, really good, and I might just change this marker shape. I think 15 is a bit too big. Maybe just do it to 8. This is a really good technique, and especially if you're in somewhere which you can't use custom visuals. Even if you can, I often try and stay away from custom visuals if you can. They're not always as performant. It just makes things a bit more complex, and I like to keep everything native if possible. Already here, I can see very easy to compare one bar graph to the other. These lines are great little notches and markers just to show the variance from this year to last year. So really, this graph is good at saying, hey, I want to compare my total sales for this year. I also want to see on top, my last year's sales. If we were only interested in the variances, then you would just plot the variances. So again, knowing what your end user wants to see, really, really important here. Using this nice little technique. And then what I normally do is I include this year-over-year indicator. And this year-over-year indicator is just a 1 or 0 column saying if sales this year is greater than last year, do a 1, if not, do a 0. So then what I often do is go to my colors. I'm just going to say, I'm going to make this a rule, and I'm going to use my year-over-year indicator. And I'm going to say, if my year-over-year indicator is 1, which with the DAX, it means this is greater than last year. Change these to numbers, then show a gray color. However, if my year-over-year indicator is 0, as in we're lower than last year, I'm going to make a red color. And I've got that the wrong way around. My indicator is backwards, so 1 means it's lower than last year in my case. So here we go. Now I've highlighted anytime the last year sales is below this year's sales. So I've got total sales here as the bar. I put in a nice gray color so it's nice, easy, clean, not highlighted. We can see last year's sales and the variance, and then immediately we're highlighting areas like this red one where last year's sales are actually above this year's, or this year's below last year's. So we're saying, hey, consulting, we've gone down compared to last year. Everything else we're up, and a nice, easy way. So this one, I think, on the right, for me, is a lot easier to read than this typical one on the left. Very clean, and all done without any custom visuals. Okay, so the next tip, use axes correctly. This is again one that's quite fairly well known. It's typically one of the first ones. This and colors, one of the first things people learn when learning about visualization. Still, you see it, and I think you can't have a top 10 tips without mentioning anything about axes. So here is my axis. You can see that I've got 3 graphs here, and we're looking at sales. The first one is one of the, as I say, one of the most common that you hear. You'll get newspapers and everything do this all the time. It looks like Loki's doing really, really well. And you can see Loki is about 3 times as high as Kate here. So I say Kate, she's done about a third of Loki, right? Because Loki's so high. Now, the big one here, it doesn't start from 0. So this axis is from 1.2 million to 1.35 million. So we need to align columns to 0, because when I see a column, I see a size. And if I see like Sunny is double Bell, I would assume that Sunny has double the sales of Bell. So the first is going to be aligned to 0. Now, when I align everything to 0, you'll see that the differences are much smaller. When you don't align to 0, it's very much exaggerates the differences in an unfair way, something that really isn't true, because, Sunny is clearly not double Bell. Sunny is actually only slightly higher than Bell. This also is somewhat true on line axes. So we see here, the second one, I have this line graph. Now, line graphs, typically the rule is you do not have to align from 0, because typically you're looking at the trend and the change. We're not doubling the height, and we're not saying about heights, so and specific heights. So for example, in the column graph, this is a height, right? Bell, and I can see Bell height is half of Sunny. This though doesn't have height, right? We can just see it's a trend. We're looking at the line itself. However, you'll notice the difference when I just zoom out slightly on the axis. This is exactly the same data, but zoomed out to a slightly different level. Which one of these is correct? Now, that's a good question. They're both correct. And showing either really is true, but they give very different messages. So I think you have to be very, very careful when using line graphs as well. Think about and make sure your end users think about kind of the differences. Is this negligible, or is this, actually a big change? So again, you just have to be really careful. Power BI does a good job at kind of auto zooming to what you want. If you're ever setting axis manually, you could do, because you might want to give this more zoomed out, kind of this bigger picture view. So be really careful. And this is especially true when you've got small subsets of data, because zooming in or zooming out can really change how the data is portrayed. The third one is another graph, which I don't really like. A lot of people seem to quite like this one, but it's this one on the top right. This is a column and a line graph, both plotted on the same graph. Sometimes this can be okay, but here we've got this cardinal sin where the line graph has this axis and then the column graph has this axis. They have different axes. I would avoid this at all costs if possible. 2 axes really do not make it easy to understand what's happening, because you have very, very, very difficult to read. Yes, comments, I see that. Column and line should never be mixed. Thank you. Yep, I agree with that. Users always read the wrong axis. And yeah, it's really hard to understand that this is the one on the right, the line axis. Again, if you did align them to the same axis, you would do something like this. Personally, you could see how much difference is just by aligning the axis. I agree with the comment. Make this 2 graphs. There's really no reason to overlay this onto the same graph. It's these 2 graphs on the left here. Make them 2 separate graphs. It's just going to be a lot easier for your end users, and I don't think there's actual need to have this on the same graph. And let me just try and advance to the next slide. There you go. 5, use the correct visual. Again, this one, we have typically 3 types of things we're doing. Comparing categories of data, comparing data over time, or single point values. So categories, column or bar graph, these are kind of the main ones you get in Power BI, and in order of what I would normally say is my favorite. Column or bar graph, right? Very easy to understand. We've all seen them before. Really effective, and that's probably why they're the most used. The combo we went over displays a lot of information. Can be confusing, right, to access. Make sure you give context, or better yet, probably don't use it. And everyone's favorite. I can't do a presentation on visualization without talking about a pile donut. These are really hated in the visual world. You know, there's a lot of issues with a pie chart. Mainly, obviously, they rely on color. So this is really difficult if you're colorblind to differentiate always between them. It's much harder to visualize, as we'll see, area than it is lines and straight height. If you only have two variables, sometimes pie charts can be okay, but you'll never get kind of the accuracy, or yes, pie is for dinner only. I agree. But you'll never get the accuracy or the needs as you would with just a simple column chart. I never think there's a point. I like to use bar or column. Changes over time. Line graph, again. Simple, easy to understand, effective, one of the most used. Reason why everyone uses it and everyone likes it so much. Ribbon chart. I actually really like the ribbon chart. To be honest, for what it does, it's one of my favorite visuals. However, I almost never use it. So if you're not familiar, ribbon is really good at this kind of ordinal data, right? Where you have things which are ranked, for example, or not even necessarily ranked, but where you're interested in seeing which is the highest. It is just it's sort of a column line chart. So the height of each one is, for example, this could be sales, I think. What is cool is that the whatever's on top. So for example, let's have a look at this month. It's ordered from the highest to the lowest. So I can see this tealy color is highest, the gray next, then this blue is number 3. This does suffer from some of the common things such as color blindness and all of this. So you have to be careful with the colors. It's not great for seeing exactly how one item changed. It is really good if you're only really interested in what's top to bottom, like the ranks. So I think for that use case, it's pretty cool, right? I mean, I can really quickly see this light blue was top all the way, apart from, you know, starting at, I think this is 2014 Q2. This gray was the top, and then this light blue kind of emerged and took over it. The one reason though that I don't use it is it's not very well known, and you have to know who's your audience. If you put this on a chart on our page, would anyone understand it? To be honest, probably not in most use cases. And if the answer is I don't know, then you'll have to assume probably not. Most people have seen a line graph before. Most people have seen a column graph. So these very confusing, not confusing, but different charts, which could be really good and could be a great way of showing data, make sure your users will understand them. Because if you have to explain it, then you've lost the effectiveness of the graph. stacked, and then or area charts in general. You don't really need area charts. This is kind of the same, right? This graph is the same as this one. To be honest, this line graph is a lot easier. It's just I'm not having to confuse my eyes by looking at things which are doubly shaded. So what is the point of shading it? There's really no value in it. Stack graphs are just terrible because stacked line graphs, it's so difficult to see actually how high this is because the height of each individual. So this red, for example, this height depends on where it starts, right? So it's really difficult to actually understand because it's not in a straight line. Nothing starts from the same point, and it's very hard to understand how the height is. So it looks like it's kind of plateaued here. You'll see. So this bit for the red, it looks like it's actually fairly flat, but it isn't because it's starting like this part's actually much smaller. So it's this has gone down even though the line's gone up. I'm confusing myself just trying to explain it. So easiest way is don't do that and just don't use it. Not really a big fan of stacked at all. Single values, again, we talked about the KPI. One thing though that I like is context. Nice if you can have a trend in the background. Often people love having trends and KPIs. Often you'll have a trend or something on the page anyway, but if not, KPI trends are great. The context though, having a value, people really like simple. And if you can say this is above or this is below a target or a goal, really helps give that KPI context. I would prefer that over a trend myself, but obviously depends on your data. I think a lot of people would say the other way around. Depends what you're trying to show. There is some things though, of course, that you can't really give a context, and don't just make up a context if it doesn't make sense. So maybe we have something called total stores. This is just a count of total stores. It's not good or bad if we have more or less. So we really don't have a context for this. It's not, we can say this is more or less than last year. We might not care though. So context is good if it means something. So always try, and most KPIs are things like sales and that kind of stuff, right? Where we're actually trying to see if this has gone up or down because it makes a difference. Some stuff doesn't. So if there is no context, just don't worry, right? Just give the number. This is more informational. Something I really don't like is these gauges. I think these are on here. So a lot of vendors, when dashboards came out as a tool, right? You were saying reporting dashboards. People kind of thought of cars and tried to make everything look like a car dashboard and have very similar views, and that's why you get this gauge. But it doesn't really help. Gauges are, to me, I still don't really know how to use them properly. I'll be honest, and it makes no sense. They're really hard to get, and people don't understand what this start because it starts at a number here and it ends at a number here. And it's always really confusing what these mean because there's no context. I guess this is a target. It's just, oh, what is the point of this, right? Very, very confusing. I don't like them myself. So yeah, with those line graphs, column charts, and KPIs for context, 90% of my reports will be that. And we're not trying to win the contest for the fanciest kind of looking stuff for no reason. It's trying to show insights, and you want to make your visuals as good looking and as aesthetic as possible, but always make sure before you do that they tell the right story and they're not confusing and they give the data that's needed, because it doesn't matter how good they look if you haven't started with you need the data and it portrays the data, then your visual has failed. Number 6 is consistency. So I'm going to head back over to Power BI for this one. There's a few things that we want to do. So when we're designing a report, so let's say I've designed my report and it looks like this. Now, there's quite a few things I can do on this, and there's a lot that's wrong with it. Let's start over on the left here. This one, I just activated my color blindness. I have this purpley color for total sales. You also have this orange color for last year's sales. So as a consumer, my first thing would say, oh, look, okay, I first look here. This is probably where I'm first going to look at a page, and I see total sales. I then kind of might go down here, and I can see here, okay, this is the same color. Instinctively, I will be in my mind linking these two colors together because it's just I've seen the color up here, and you've told me it means total sales. I'm going to assume it's going to mean total sales down here. Well, no, because this is something completely different. This often happens when we try and use corporate branding colors, right? And we want to use the same colors again and again. There's no need to reuse these colors. And it gets very confusing because we've used the same colors for different things. So one thing I'm going to do is, okay, maybe the best way of doing this is, why do I need so many colors? I need to have so many colors because this bottom left chart is a donut. What if I did this? What if I changed this to make it a bar graph like this? Now I can go in and I can say, well, actually, these colors now don't actually mean anything. So I can just change this all, change it to all. Happy eyes been. Normally I'll just probably rebuild this graph, but let me all change this, right, to this purple. So this is unnecessary to have all those colors. The easiest way to stop using colors for the same thing is one of the reasons where you'll reuse a color for two different meanings is because you have too many colors. So if I can get rid of some colors, then that's much better. So the second thing I'm going to do is, okay, I can see here, I've got sales versus last year by this is salesperson. And then I've got it by sales versus last year by category. These two are both showing sales versus last year sales, so sales versus last year, but they're just different things of interest, so what different dimensions that we're using. However, they're completely different graphs. The next thing about consistency is whenever we're talking about the same thing, and this is the same, essentially the same KPIs, this should look the same, right? Because now it's very confusing because I'm using two completely different graphs. So what I can do is I'm just going to switch this over again, make this into my line graph, just like I have the other one. So that if I'm using the same information, sales versus last year, I'm going to want to say this is sales versus last year, and these two are exactly the same looking graphs. This way, I can look at them both and very quickly understand what they mean. So let me just quickly change this. So I'm just going to mimic it, and then I will just change the same. Just change it to line. RBI is going live demo likes to just. Here we go. So I'm going to change this to rule again, and then I'm going to put the same thing in, highlight it the same way, right? Because it's sales versus last year, so I can use the same DAX measure. Over, so I'm just saying if it's a 0, we're going to do a gray this time, and if it's a 1, we want to do a red. And there we go. Now, because this one and this one is very easy to understand, and we can see quickly because they're the same graph, they're looking at the same sort of thing. With the same type of thing where we're comparing sales versus last year, let's use the same graph. Now, I also see though, one thing that this is showing is I've got sales versus last year here, sales versus last year here, profit and profit. You'll notice I have now, when I change my colors, I use the same colors for profit in both spaces. So profit here is purple. Over here, profit is also purple. Sales, which is higher than last year, is gray. Sales, which is lower than last year, is red. So really, really consistent. And it's a good way of keeping things. So I can just look at this and I know instantly where the profit is and the difference between the metrics. However, this one here, and this line graph, these are all sales. So what I want to do is I'm probably going to rearrange this. And I'm going to say, well, these two are profit. So let's put profit over here together. Let's put sales over here together. And you know what? Let's give it a bit of space. Let's do this, and probably I'll arrange this and actually do a bit more science into how big they are, but I'm just quickly arranging. So now I put my two profit measures together. I've added some space. Then I know here that this space is kind of separating in my mind my sales side of the dashboard compared to my profit side of the report. And then finally, what I'll do is, again, this is sales. So let's keep the color, right? So I want to say my sales is, well, generally gray, and I'm using this red to highlight stuff. So let's keep this as a gray. And now all my sales kind of numbers the same. I'll just say this. And then what I would also do is probably, keep the, this is one I did earlier, just format it a bit nicer, keep all the titles the same, right? Keep the legends the same. So now this consistency makes it a lot easier to read. Before, when everything was all over the place, it's very difficult to understand. So keeping things consistent means a lot about the colors, where you place things, and using the same sort of graphs. Again, you can see that from where I started, where the same information was very difficult to understand, to this consistency here, where I can quickly see that my profit and my sales, this is what it's measuring, and where and what each one means. Number 7, be linear. So we kind of touched on this before, but I want everyone, and if you want to put it in the chat, I'll give a few seconds as well. So it's going to be a question. So get ready. I'm going to show you 3 products, right? And I want you to rank them in order from worst to best for the bottom 3. So I want the worst selling product, say that first, then say the second worst selling product, and then the third worst selling product. And put it in the chat, and I'm going to time how long the first person gets it. So I'm going to show you a graph, some products in and their sales figures, and I want to put you worst, second worst, and third worst. Okay, go. So this could be, B, D, F, or something like that, if that was the order of worst to best. I'll put it in the chat if you have that open. I'll give 30 seconds, and if anyone gets it. I think we had our first answer. DFC. Yeah, I think that's right. DFC. DFC, although I have my doubts, yeah. It took us a while to get there, and it wasn't easy. You'll see, obviously, I've kept these at different formats. And the numbers look a bit the same, right? Cheesy little, but that's not easy. And I think we all know that. This is why we don't have tables on pages. So I'm going to say now, okay, let's make it easier. I know tables aren't great. So let's put another one in. I'm going to show you the same numbers. Now, let's try and think the 4th, 5th, 6th best selling. So in that order, number the 4th and the 5th and the 6th. In my graph, I'll zoom in for you. And have fun on this one. If anyone's colorblind here, good luck. If anyone's just not colorblind either, good luck. Yeah, this is a prime example, right, of why people hate pie charts and really common one. I probably most of us have heard this before. We cannot see area well. Firstly, the colors are confusing because there's so much work having to basically decode the colors. So I see this, I have to go over there. I see this orange, I have to look over here and then figure out which one it is. It's very confusing. The other thing is, even if I got the colors, I still have no idea which one's bigger. They all look about the same to me. And that's because it's so hard for us to understand area, right? Because we're trying to see area in a non-linear way. Last one, top three selling, best to worst, right? So the best, second, the third worst. And feel free to type, but I'm going to tell you the answer here. It's GEB, right? The best selling is G, so number 1, 2, 3. It's ordered for us. You can't order a pie chart, really. And if you did, you wouldn't really know where to start. Again, this is why obviously linear is so good. We can see small differences very easily. I can see the difference between A and C here, right? And I can see this difference and this difference here, even though that difference is very small. It's only probably a few percent. This one obviously is so much easier. So this is just a really nice way to reinforce. I'm sure you've probably heard, we don't like having tables, we don't like having pie charts, use bar graphs. This is a great example of why. And again, this might be an example, and sometimes it might not be this extreme, but often you will see very similar to this. 8, keep it simple. So a few things here, and this is just kind of a combination of different rules. And there was a question, I'll just go back to it. If you use sort by product as ascending, so you're kind of, I think the question is, and correct me if I'm wrong, what if we wanted to sort it in by product name, or was it by the other way around? So product name. Typically in Power BI, we'll do this. It will sort it by your KPI. And I think that's normally always the correct way to do it. This is really good, and we'll see this at the end briefly on understanding how your end users are going to use this visual. The only way I would sort it by product name is if the user was looking for a specific product most of the time and I wanted to see it. Even then, I probably wouldn't, because this has an implied order, right? I know which is best to worst already, and this is ordered for me. A lot of times people are trying to say, okay, is B higher than C? Or, E, is that higher than B? If you order it by the KPI, in this time sales, that's always going to be obvious. The other advantage is that these look very, very close. However, I know B is higher than A because I know inherently this is sorted from B to A. And because I do this on every graph, I know they're all going to be sorted this way. So again, being consistent across everything. I would always sort by the KPI because you have that consistency and very quickly gives you that inherent order, and it really lets you know which one's higher, and you can compare it, and I can easily see, oh, E is beating out B, right? So, and that's normally 90% plus of times how we're going to be using a visual like this. So number 8, keep it simple. Again, order visuals from highest to lowest, generally highest to lowest. Could do it vice versa. Pick a common way though across your visuals, because if you order it from highest to lowest in 80% of your visuals and then you have one which isn't, people are going to misread that because they're just going to think, because that's how they've seen it done every other way, that it is ordered that way. Power BI will do this automatically for you. I wouldn't change it if I was you. The data inc ratio. This is quite a popular one that's been around for a while. This basically says, and this was Tufte, who called him the godfather of visualization, did a lot of this research and visualization. He said, what a good graph is called the data ink ratio. And you have something called the data ink. This is any ink that's used in that visual. So ink, you can think of anything when we're drawing, right? Any part of that visual, which is used to display information specific that you're trying to get, like the insights. And the total ink is just everything else, everything in the graph. So a good example is if we had a line graph like this, and then we had a line, this all in red would be the data ink, because the axis tells us the numbers, the lines actually show the data. Things like titles, things like grid lines, right? If we have grid lines like this, or things like if we put a border around it, these are all things which we're just trying to make the graph look prettier. That's not actually giving us any information. That's not displaying any information, right? It's just making the graph look prettier. Anything that's making the graph look prettier, that's the totaling. We want to reduce that. We want to reduce anything which isn't actually telling us what the end number is. And we'll go through an example of this later. Don't repeat yourself is another one. A big one of this is if you have, and we'll show this again in the next example, but if you have a title and it says sales by date, you probably don't need to then label your axis sales and date. So I think most people would be able to understand which one's sales and which one's date. And to be honest, I don't normally have the title. If you have set or don't even have the axis, one of them, you don't need to repeat them. We'll have a good example of this too. Again, careful with color. It's estimated about 9% of males are colorblind. It's a lot more common in males. That means that generally certain color blindness, the big issue is they can have difficulty distinguishing between two different colors. So if you think that two of your colors, people might not be able to spot a difference and they might look like the same color to them, that makes it a lot of any visuals like pie charts that rely on color very, very useless essentially. And then finally show goals, targets, and variance. Again, we've spoken about this. This is that context. If we show something, 8.4%, right? What does this mean? Show some context. Is this up or down from last year? And this can be applied not just to KPIs, but to other graphs as well. So let's have a look at all of these in action. So I've got some bar graph here, and it's category by sales by category, I should say. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm actually going to order this. Again, see here, when I had it as ABC, ordered by product name, category name, it's a bit hard to compare and to see. I have to do a bit more work. Once I order them, this makes it very quick and simple for me to understand the highest to the lowest. Then I'm going to see this data ink ratio. So what I've done is all these background lines, right, these grid lines, I'm just going to take them off. 90% of the time when you're using graphs like this, I don't need to know the exact numbers. If I did, I might have a different way or have some download of data or something like that, or hover. But I'm really interested in seeing how they compare to each other. So I'm never really going to be following along these lines. To be honest, I can kind of tell where they are, and I'm more interested in how they compare to each other rather than the exact number. So those background lines aren't helping me. Then I'm going to remove these axes. Again, this here says sales by category. Here is the word sales and here is the word category. I don't need to repeat myself. I already said it's sales by category. So unless your users really haven't seen a graph before, if I said this, I can very quickly see, right, that this down here is the category and this will be my sales. So because I have the title, I don't need the axis as well. One thing that is good, it's quite good, and Power BI has actually started doing this, to align your title to the left. The reason we do that is that if you're in most Western kind of English speaking or kind of non-Arabic speaking countries, we read left to right. So we always start in this point, right? That's where we would start reading a page or anything. That's top left is where we start and we look. So this is where we want to have the title. That means we're always going to see the title first, and then we're going to look at the graph. If it's off over here somewhere, then we might miss the title. We might just start looking down here because we're used to starting left, top left, kind of left to right. So we start looking at the graph first. So it just makes it a bit easier. The second thing I did, you'll see, is that these axes, right, they're big and black and really bold. I just muted them a bit. This is, again, not giving any specific information to us. They're not really helping. They're just there just to kind of show us where the axes are. But I want to not highlight those. I want to push them to the background. We need them, because obviously I need to see where the 0 axis are. That's important. But they don't need to be bold, and I just want to just mute them a bit. So mute your axis, mute, and I also muted my title a bit. Still bold so I can read it, but it's not overtaking the graph because I want the data to be the key point. Then, what is the point of those colors, right? All these colors are meaningless now. I mean, it's per category, but I've labeled the category. So because I'm using a graph like this, I don't need the colors. This stops me running the risk of reusing that color for something else, because if I use it at C, it always should be C on everything else. And now it's just easier and it's a bit less garish. Then let's add some context. So again, the context doesn't just have to be on a KPI, right? When we're talking about this year versus last year, let's add it to the column graph as well. Again, this nice trick of adding this with a line graph. I'm going to do that and say, I'm going to add the context to this and then highlight bits of interest, right? So everything's gray. Now the colors do mean something. So gray is normal and this red is lower than last year. The reason as well, by the way, I use grays and red is because gray is just a very standard muted color. Red is a highlight color. So the red is highlighting points of interest. Typically, when we're looking at this, we're looking for points of interest and we say, oh, this is lower. I will then probably go and drill into this point or maybe drill through to another page. I want to make it obvious for my users which points they're interested in. I don't want to use two colors. I don't want to put green for the ones which are above last year. I just want to highlight one because I want to highlight the one which I think my users, when I say one, I don't mean 1 point. I mean either lower or higher than last year. I'm just highlighting points which are lower than last year. That's because this is what my users are most interested in. They're trying to increase their sales. They're seeing where sales have dropped. You can't highlight every single thing, right? When I revise from a book, when I study, I don't highlight every word on the page. That would be pointless. You highlight bits which you're trying to make an impact. So this is why I just use the red to highlight. Everything else is a nice gray muted color where it's just showing the data and I can see it clearly and cleanly. So yeah, this is cleaning up, be very, very clean with your visuals. Extrapolation. Again, stepping away into more general BI or just data, I think, on this one. Let's have a point and feel free to put this in the chat as well, a bit more interaction. What is the expected value of y when x is 35? So not a trick question. This is x down here. This is the value of y, right? So when x is 35, which is this number. Now there's no right or wrong answer to this. So just have a guess. What do you think y is going to be? In a 9, 10-ish. What if I did this? Right? Maybe I did this. I did this. I think now we would probably all say, yeah, I think we're all probably on the same track here. I would as well. Yeah, I would go with you. I would estimate it's about 10 because yeah, it's all the information we have. Let's take this into an actual practical example. It is a trap. This is about me. So this is just asking, how many cats do you think I will own in the year 2035? And this is true. To give you some context, because I am a cat person, right? This could be trick. I had in 2015, I had I had a cat. So I had one cat, right? Then a couple of years later, me and my wife in 2018, we got him a brother. So now I had two cats. Currently, in the year 20, well, even now, 2023 or 2020, we have a third cat. And so I currently have three cats. Let's take our same approach that we did last time, where we said, okay, let's draw the line like we did here, right? We draw the line between and we just extend to make a guess. So I'm going to do this. Let's extend this out and then plot in 2035. If we use that same logic we just did to get to the number 10, we're going to assume that I will have 10 cats again in 2035. I will tell you now, that's going to be very, very unlikely. I will have 10 cats in 2035. I'll be honest, 3 is a lot of cats to own. Extrapolation can be very difficult. Once you extend past the known points you have to be very careful. Even though in this this example it looks very simple, right? We just have to be careful, and I see this a lot. The feline chart, I love it. We see this a lot, and you can make assumptions, yes, but just be careful if you're making assumptions right on this dotted blue line. If you're trying to predict the future, things do often very commonly taper off, right? Often lines don't continue in a straight line up forever. You can always expand and extend a trend line. So putting it all together into the report design framework. And I'm just going to skip through these two. We're just going to go to, I just want to show this slide. Typically, this is my report design framework. I actually have a few, if you Google it, there's some good YouTube videos out there, which is like 3 hours going into depth. But how to put all of these together. My report design framework is really looking at these 4 steps. The first thing I ever do is this design flow map, where after chatting through and understanding the data, understanding the audience, I will just basically map out what each page, how many pages, what their name is, the type of page they are, right? Is it a main page? Then I'll go into this layout. For each page, before I get into Power BI, very simply put out the layout where I think the main graphs are going to go on that page. Now, this is the really important one when you're designing each visual. You have to ask a few questions. And the questions I always ask is, what question do you want to answer with this visual? And I said, what answered, what will be your next question? And then what action is being taken from the visual? And really what I'm trying to get to is, well, you've told me you want to see maybe sales versus, category. Why do you need to see that? Are you trying to highlight, for example, points of interest where you're going to drill in? That lets you design your graphs, design your visuals into ways of knowing, using all this, right? Are we trying to highlight this year versus last year? What context do you need for your visual? Are we actually looking at variances? Are we looking at comparisons? So having this design process going through, being very methodical before you open Power BI, right? I do all of this, maybe the scrims and the actual layouts I'll do at the end. Go through all of this first, spend some time giving designs.